Okay, I'm going to start in about 5 seconds. So you ready to spotlight us?
Yeah, Deepak, Chloe, you guys are ready to go.
All right, a warm welcome to all our participants, wherever you are. Thank you for making the time to join this seminar on preventing violence against children in schools. This is part of it's an affiliate event for the Solution Summit, and it's co-hosted by the Coalition for Good Schools and Safe to Learn initiative. And my name is Deepak Nakar, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Coalition for Good Schools. The Coalition for Good Schools is a network of practitioners based in the Global South, all of whom are interested in preventing violence against children in schools. And we just recently launched in September, so this is one of our first events in terms of public-facing events. With that, maybe I will ask my co-host, Chloe, to introduce herself, tell us a little bit about Safe to Learn, and then introduce our first speaker. Over to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Deepak. So like Deepak, I'm extremely pleased to welcome you all to this event on preventing violence in and through schools. In the name of the Safe to Learn Coalition, my name is Chloe Fevre. I am the director of Safe to Learn Global Initiative. And Safe to Learn is a coalition of 14 very powerful partners from different fields, from education to violence prevention to child protection and health, that decided 2-3 years ago to join forces to accelerate progress towards ensuring that all children are indeed safe to learn. And the Safe to Learn initiative sits within the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, which is itself a partnership that gathers more than 600 organizations dedicated to ending violence against children. And today we're very lucky because we have the executive director of the End Violence Partnership, Howard Taylor, who has been kind enough to set us off to a good start with his opening remark. So without further ado, over to you, Howard.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Deepak, and thanks to both of you for bringing us all together today for what I think is a really important conversation at a really important moment. And I think we're going to have a conversation today about what I believe is the clear and compelling case to end violence in and through schools. And we're going to have an opportunity to hear from a range of experts about what works to make that happen. We know the COVID-19 pandemic has caused an unprecedented global education crisis. More than 1 billion children have had their learning significantly disrupted, including by prolonged school closures. But the pandemic has also highlighted the critical protective role that schools play in so many aspects of a child's life. With school closures, countless children, and particularly the most vulnerable, have lost that protection. They've lost the support that schools offer. And at the same time, they've been exposed to increased violence and abuse at home, online, and in their communities. But of course, schools are not always the safe places that they should be for children to learn, to play, to socialize, and to pursue their dreams. Violence and abuse from teachers, adults, fellow students, both online and offline, sadly, is widespread in schools globally. And many girls and boys are also exposed to physical violence and sexual abuse on the journey to and from school. And this violence and abuse, we know, has devastating consequences for children and for their education. Violence against children reduces school attendance, it lowers academic performance, and it increases dropout rates. And it negatively impacts on students' ability to focus and to enjoy what should be a joyful learning experience, and then to succeed in school. Earlier this year, as part of the Together to End Violence campaign and Solutions Summit series, the End Violence Partnership convened a group of experts to prepare a set of global policy proposals to end all forms of violence and abuse against children. And from a very long initial list, 6 proposals emerged and were later endorsed by global leaders. And those 6 proposals included a call for the political and financial commitments necessary to make all schools safe, non-violent, and inclusive. And they did so because investing to make learning safe offers a multiplier win. a win that reduces violence in and beyond schools, improves learning outcomes, and better leverages all the other investments that are made in child health and development. And the Safe to Learn initiative and the Coalition for Good Schools, the co-conveners of today's event, show us the way. They show us how to get this done. In July, the Safe to Learn Coalition launched a new strategy and an investment case for ending violence in schools, and that was done at the Global Education Summit. And then just last month, as Deepak mentioned, leaders in the education and violence prevention sector in the Global South launched the Coalition for Good Schools. And today we'll hear more about both initiatives and about the case for investing to prevent violence in schools. And I expect that we will all leave in 90 minutes, both more informed, but also, I think, and I hope, more inspired. And that inspiration really matters because, frankly, business as usual will not be enough. We need to see a step change in our collective ambition, action, and investment. And as I said at the start, the case for action, the case for investment is clear and compelling. We know that schools should be a safe place for every child. We know that violence undermines all learning and development. And we know, and we're going to hear today, about what can work to prevent violence and abuse in learning environments. So let's seize this moment that the world is in. It is a moment of flux and transition, but let's translate that into a season of transformation for children. Let's make sure that every child, wherever they may live, is safe to learn. Thank you.
Wow, that was a brilliant opening, Howard. Thank you so much for putting the inspiration up and forward to start this event. It's exactly what we want to do. And together, hopefully by the end of the event, you will feel a little bit more inspired and ready to contribute, as we are trying to do on a daily basis. So as Deepak said, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers and panelists today that are with us to share their experience and their expertise on preventing violence in and through schools. And we are very happy to have them, but we are very happy to have you all as well. And so before I hand over to Deepak to present the first session and how this event will be composed, let's try to see in a first poll where the audience come from, where you all come from. So Kristen, if you can just show the poll. We have just a few minutes. If you can click, we would be very grateful, just to have an idea. As we all know, unfortunately, violence against children and violence in school is a global phenomenon. So we really need to build up this global community to address this challenge. So we can see that actually 1/3 is actually pretty divided. 1/3 comes from Sub-Saharan Africa, another third from Europe, and then we have North America, Latin America, and South Asia coming up. Central Asia is missing, so we need to reach out to our colleagues from Central Asia next time. But with that, thanks a lot, and over to you, Deepak.
Thank you, Chloe. It's really gratifying to see that we have such a wide audience from so many different regions of the world. And so in the next 65 minutes or so that we have together, what we'd like to do is divide this event into 3 different parts. The first part is asking ourselves, why focus on preventing violence against children in schools? And then we'll have 2 presentations making the case around that. And then we will have a panel that will reflect on those questions. And then in the third part, we'll focus on some of the questions that we hear from you and some of the things that emerge from the discussions. And hopefully we'll be done within 75 minutes total. We know you're busy and we know you have lots of other things planned around this. So let's begin with a clear question in front of us. It is that why focus on violence against children in schools? Violence against children, as Howard has just pointed out, is a major problem. And it manifests in multiple settings, it manifests in multiple ways, and is caused by multiple factors. And therefore, it is a complex problem. And therefore, our response to it must be strategic. We can't just pick away at it and hope that we'll make progress. We need to make early choices. And what we are here to do in this session today is to make a case of why focus on the issue of violence against children in school as a strategic imperative. And what I want to do in the kind of 2 or 3 minutes that I have is to present to you 4 kind of key points in terms of why school is a great opportunity. So the first point I want to make to you is that school is a natural opportunity for preventing violence against children. Almost 1 billion children are expected at a school in any given day. They spend a lot of time at school, and they are in the presence of adults who have a duty of care towards them. So that's a great opportunity, and it's a strategic imperative to use that opportunity to prevent violence against children. Secondly, education system is a formalized system. And we all know that interventions that work at systems level have much more chances of succeeding over the long haul. So if we have a formalized system through which education is delivered, and there are opportunities at multiple points in that system to create an intervention, then the likelihood of success is much more than, say, if we were doing ad hoc intervention. The third reason I want to give to you is that violence against children at schools undermines the purpose of school. Yeah, that we all send our children to schools because we hope that they will pick up cognitive skills, they'll pick up social skills, maybe they'll discern the difference between right and wrong and become ethical, and maybe change agents in their community. Violence against children at schools undermines all those aspirations that we have in terms of why we send children to school. And then finally, what I want to say to you is that school is in some ways our highest aspiration as a society. Parents who didn't have opportunities send their children to school in the hope that they will have all the opportunities and advantages that they didn't have. And in many ways, violence against children in schools undermines that aspiration. So in many schools, for example, parents send children to schools because that is the most viable path out of poverty. And yet violence against children undermines that. And I could go on giving you more reasons, but for all those reasons, focusing on the issue of violence against children in schools is not only a strategic imperative, but it is also a moral imperative, in the sense that we should do it because that's the right thing to do. Yeah. But you may still ask, so how big is this problem? And then what are the consequences of not prioritizing it? Yeah, why should we prioritize it in global priority list? The next two presentations focus particularly on that case. The first one, I will invite Karen in a minute, addresses the magnitude of the problem. And the second one with Quentin, we will look at essentially what are the implications if we don't address this violence against children in schools now. So with that, I would like to welcome Karen de Vries. Karen has published widely and contributed original thought pieces to the literature on violence against children in school. She's a social epidemiologist at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And she's here to discuss a little bit about the magnitude of the problem. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Deepak, and thanks so much to all of you for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm quite flattered. So as Deepak mentioned, I am a social epidemiologist by training, and I've spent probably the bulk of my career focused on violence prevention research. So on violence against children, but then also specifically focused on school violence, because I think that's actually one of the most important public health problems facing children globally today. Next, please, Devin. So I'm sure I don't have to mention to anyone who's attending this that levels of violence against children are very high. And our best estimates to date tell us that 1 billion children experience some form of physical, sexual, or emotional violence every year. So that's half of the world's children are experiencing violence. So I think on the positive side, oh, sorry, could you go back? Thank you, Devin. On the positive side, us as a global, sorry, back to the first slide. Thank you. So violence is a massive issue, and I think us as a global community, we are starting to pay attention to this. So there are specific violence reduction targets across the Sustainable Development Goals. So under number 4, around quality education, number 5, around gender equality, and number 16, about peace and strong institutions. But we've got a big task on our hands. We want to reduce this number from 1 billion every year to 0. So I think we really need to think strategically about prevention and about addressing this violence. And to do that, we need to look at where it happens and who is doing the violence. So, and I think schools are a special setting in this case. Unfortunately for children, they're experiencing violence across, all of the environments where they live, where they play, where they work. But in terms of thinking about the time that people spend in different environments, globally, children spend more time in school than any other setting besides their home where they're living. So if we want to actually meet these overall SDG targets about reducing violence in childhood, we really need to focus on violence in schools. Okay, next please, Devin. Thanks. So we know that more than 90% of children are enrolled globally in primary school. But yet, from a data standpoint, we actually still don't measure prevalence of school violence comprehensively in any one survey. So what we have is different surveys that measure little bits of this problem. And so what we do know from those little bits of research are that the scale of school violence in particular is vast. So if we take just school-age children, for example, we can see from the data that 60% or more of these children are experiencing physical and emotional violence from peers. So if we're considering that age group, that actually makes that form of violence more common than caregiver violence in that same age group. On teacher violence, for example, we actually don't collect a large amount of data on teacher violence globally, but we know that 73 countries currently don't have any legal prohibition on corporal punishment in schools, and half of all children globally live in these countries. When it comes to sexual violence, again, we don't collect much comparable data on that globally, but there's some school-based data on sexual harassment where 11% of students are reporting that across 96 countries. So it's a massive, massive problem. And I've put up here UNESCO's typology of school-related gender-based violence, because I think it's a useful way to visualize how some of this violence can manifest and overlap. And very importantly, when we're thinking about prevention, we've got to think about this patterning and this overlap, because as we all know, there are inequalities in how this violence is experienced. So girls will experience different forms of violence to boys, younger children versus adolescents, children with and without disabilities, for example. So all of that is crucial when we're thinking about how to prevent violence. Okay, next, please. Great. So when we're thinking about the impacts of childhood violence, we're starting to, in the broader field of violence research, have good data from studies where we follow individual participants over time. And these are really showing us that the impacts of violence can be quite long-lasting. And they also span, many different sectors and areas of life, really. So in the health field, which is where I spend my life working, we know that people who experience childhood violence are more likely to become depressed, suicidal, have more sexually transmitted infections, and a whole range of other adverse health outcomes. In the education sphere, we know violence predicts lower educational attainment, earlier dropout, and even work. There's good research showing that childhood violence can predict lower likelihood of employment even 30 years later. So the impacts are really quite far-reaching. And for me as a violence researcher, I think it's also important to recognize that people who experience childhood violence are more likely to go on to have violent, intimate partnerships when they're adults, which really sets up this intergenerational cycle of violence and leads these poor outcomes to repeat. There's some quite interesting newer research that's coming out of South Africa, which is suggesting that school violence may have additional effects over and on top of violence experienced in other settings. And I would also say from a research perspective that we're probably underestimating the impacts of violence, because most of our evidence on this actually comes from high-income countries, which tend to have a lower prevalence of some forms of violence. Okay, next, please. Thank you. So we've seen clearly that school violence is a massive issue, and there's a really important set of outcomes that can be prevented if we can prevent school violence. But it's a big challenge that we've got trying to reduce that number from 1 billion to 0. But on a more optimistic note, where there's challenge, I think there's also opportunity. And as a public health person, I'm quite excited about the reach of schools as a platform to address violence. So doing direct prevention of violence in and around schools will reduce a lot of violence and bring us quite a long way towards achieving actually some of the SDG targets. But I think the potential doesn't stop there. There's some really interesting research showing that changing school climate and ethos and culture around violence so that violence isn't tolerated, showing that these effects can actually ripple out of schools and affect how people see violence in broader communities. So I think schools are an interesting platform for broader societal change. And last, I think it's also really important to acknowledge all of the children who have experienced violence already. And I think schools have got sort of untapped potential to respond to some of these children and provide them with additional support. So could potentially function as safe spaces for children to disclose to stop further violence from happening. Okay, I will leave us there on that optimistic note. Thank you very much. Pass back to Deepak.
Thank you, Karen. You know, I think that I share your optimism that there are really interesting interventions that are coming online. Let me ask you a follow-up question then, Karen. That you're laying out that the problem is large, and we have potential interventions that are showing promise. Why do you think it's taken us so long to get focused on the issue of violence against children in schools, given that you've been thinking about this for a while? Do you have any speculations on that?
Yeah, that is it's an important question. I guess I would say that I think it's twofold, really. I think one is that violence for a long time has always been some other sector's issue. So in the health sector, we say, oh no, that's an education issue. Maybe in the education sector, people might say, oh no, that's a health issue. And it's been sort of passed around and not owned particularly by any particular discipline or sector. And the other reason, if I'm going to be very blunt, is that I think some of the forms of violence in schools, particularly teacher violence, you know, it is very uncommon in some of the high income countries where money to fund research and programs is flowing from. So for example, I'm from Canada originally, and this form of violence didn't happen to me when I was in school, wasn't on my radar at all, until I actually came to sit with Raising Voices many years ago in Uganda, and then realized the magnitude of this problem.
Thank you, Karen. And yeah, no, in some ways, that's why the work that we are collectively doing right now, or bringing various actors to the table, right? That this is a collective problem that we should all own together. That's a really important part of it. There's one quick follow-up question. Do you have anything to say about involving parents in some of this intervention and the potential role that they can play? Do you have a quick answer to the, or thought on that? That this is from Sabine.
I mean, I think that's, yeah, that's quite exciting. I don't think there's too much research at the moment that's sort of crossing the school and home divide. But yeah, you can see how programs that are involving kind of multiple overlapping layers of children's environments would be quite beneficial.
Thank you, Ken. Maybe let's turn now to Quentin. Quentin is an economist at the World Bank. He has published more than 500 papers, so people know him. He's done analysis, and most importantly for us, Quentin has just published earlier this year in the summer, together with his co-authors, an investment case on preventing violence against children in schools. So Quentin, maybe we'll hand over to you in terms of what are some of the implications of not addressing this question? Violence.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepak. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. So I think I have 7 minutes to try to run you through some of the analysis that we did for this investment case on ending violence in school. And thanks again to the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children and the Safe to Learn initiative for funding this work. So we were asked to try to see what are the impacts of violence in schools in different domains, and can we put cost estimate to those impacts, and then also most importantly, what can we actually do? And Chloe, who introduced the session, is actually the person who worked the most on the so what do we do, right? So I'm going to go through those various topics. So the first impacts, as Karen said, is we know that violence in schools has negative effects on the experience of the children in school. I mean, whether they have friends in school, whether they like to go to school. It leads to lower attendance and higher rates of dropouts. And it leads also, for example, to lack of trust in the school or in the teachers. And all of this then turns to less learning while in school and lower educational attainment. And one person asked in the chat, so what kind of data are you using? So we used hundreds of surveys for this study. We used the JSHS. We use, this is for developing countries mostly, HBSC for Europe, Canada, and a few countries in the Middle East. We also used the DHS, we used the VACs. So we tried to look at essentially correlations, because we couldn't do really impact evaluations as part of this study, and look at how violence in schools was associated with less learning or lower educational attainment. So the impacts are relatively large, perhaps not so much in absolute terms, but they are comparable to the impacts of other things that we talk about most of the time. So, for example, having better materials in schools, better pedagogy, the impact of disability, the impact of different things. Well, violence in schools has an impact that is fairly similar. Now, we came up with a cost estimate for the world. And how did we do that? It's based on measures of human capital wealth, which are the future value, the present value of the future earnings of the labor force, how much education accounts for human capital wealth, and then how much violence reduces schooling and learning. And we came up to 11 trillion. And actually, I won't have the time to explain how we came up to that number, but Deepak may ask me sometime later, what does that number mean, right, at the country level or at the school level? But at the global level, the impact is very large, and the cost is very high. Now, what I find actually personally even more important is the impacts on health. And Karen mentioned that in the health world, there's a lot of awareness of the impact of violence on a range of health outcomes. So, of course, injuries from fights, risky behaviors, alcohol, drug use, having sex before 18 years of age, lack of trust in others, suicidal thought or acting and attempting suicide, a range of health problems that people can talk about, whether they have headaches, backaches, higher tolerance towards violence as well, and not feeling safe in school. And what I found interesting, or it's actually not interesting, but very, very worrying, is that typically the impact of violence in schools on those indicators was larger than the impact on the traditional educational attainment and learning measures. And recall that that $11 trillion measure that I mentioned before actually relates only to the impact on educational attainment and learning. We didn't try to measure the impact on health, right? So we are really probably well underestimating the global cost of the issue of violence in school. Now, there is a big part of the study, and perhaps the most important part for people who are actually in the trenches doing work on looking at what kind of interventions we can implement. And I guess that the panel afterwards will talk more about that, right? But we essentially recommend to start from interventions at the preschool level or even before a child is born to interventions in primary school and in secondary school along a life cycle, if you will, right? And we have different suggestions of interventions according to each of those steps. Now, one thing that was mentioned again in the chat, which is very important, and there might not be that much research, but we all know it's really fundamental, is the fact that the violence in school does not operate in a vacuum, right? It operates in a community. What happens at home has an effect. And so we have this diagram in the study about what is called the ecological framework. And one of the things that we recommend, and Deepak would be happy because I'll cite again the Good School Toolkit, is interventions that are broader, right? That involve the whole school, but also when they can, the parents, the community, and so on. So I had only 7 minutes, and I've kept 1.5 minutes about what next, right? And I do want to explain a little bit what's coming up next from this work, or what we would hope to do in the ideal world. So first, we are going to finalize, hopefully within the next few months, what we call an e-learning course, which will be available freely on the web for anybody who wants to take it. That is based in part on the study, but also brings in a lot of other material. That's going to be a 3 or 4 hour course that people can take at their leisure to learn more about this topic. With Chloe, we decided, or we were thinking about doing regional briefs. I mean, the situation is not the same in different parts of the world. I mean, Karen mentioned that too, right? Even though violence is in school, it's widespread everywhere. But we could perhaps do regional briefs and then importantly, country analysis, right? Because what happens in the end is at the level of a country. And so if there are interest in doing country analysis, please let us know. We can at the minimum share the data that we already have because we have done these estimations with hundreds of countries and surveys, but perhaps we can do more in-depth work in a specific country. We hope to create Excel tool so that people can actually play with those tools, do their own simulations and do their own costing analysis. How much would it cost to implement programs and what might I get from it? Now in blue in that slide, you have a few other extensions. It's less certain that we will do it and I just am running out of time, so I'll go quickly, but I'll mention 3 things. One is there's a peculiar phenomenon, at least in the US, it's not the case elsewhere, and I asked Karen about that in the data that she had for Uganda, but that in some religious schools or some types of schools, there might be less violence than other types of schools. And this is not an argument for or against religious schools, it's just that the school culture has a lot of importance, and we need to try to understand why do we have this difference between different types of schools. At the bank, there is a health team, which is part of what is called the GFF, Global Financing Facility. And we are trying to put out a study that suggests a basic package of interventions for school health. We have 10 interventions, and one of them is preventing violence in school. And so we hope that this will be something else that will be available to you. And then the last question, but that's a much broader topic, is should we try to do something similar to what we do for violence in schools for other types of violence, right? Extending even the scope of the analysis. So I've gone through a lot of things. I'm going to stop to share. I'm a bit above 7 minutes, but I hope that this gave you a little bit of a feeling for what is in that study. And the study, as well as a short summary of 12 pages, is available for free download. You'll type it in Google and you'll find it. Thank you.
Thank you, Quentin. And you make a really compelling case. And I thank you for trying to summarize a really complex report and analysis that you've done in 7 minutes. So let me ask you just one follow-up question that I've been hearing about the analysis is that the cost is high and we're talking about lifetime cost of $11 trillion. A lot of people will have a hard time imagining what 11 trillion means. Can you say something that can help us park that number in our head?
Right. I mean, there are different reasons why we came with that number, and I mean, with a global number as opposed to a number, for example, child that is affected by violence. Right now, the global number is very large, and actually, it's an underestimation, I think. Right. Now, if you look at a number in comparison to, for example, what is the total human capital wealth in the world, right? As I mentioned, we try to frame the analysis in terms of the loss in human capital wealth. And human capital wealth is the future or the present value of the future earnings of the labor force, right? The number as a share, as a percentage, right, of total human capital wealth is not that high, actually, right? If I recall, it's less than 2%. So the number in absolute is very large, but it's not necessarily a number that is very large in percentage terms, right? And so if you do an analysis at the school level, you would get a much smaller number. But here is, to me, something that is very important. And that is one of the reasons why we might want to create those Excel tools and analysis that facilitates implementation at the country or school level. It is that the cost is high in absolute terms. It's not necessarily very high as a percentage of total human capital wealth, but the cost of the interventions to reduce violence in school is also not that large, right? And so the benefit to cost ratio then is typically high, right? And most of the interventions that we look at in the part of the study on the interventions suggest that those interventions have a benefit to cost ratio, I mean, ranging from 4 or 5 to 15, let's say, right? So you get 4 or 5 to 15 times more in comparison to what you invest, right? So maybe that answer was too long, but more than the broad cost, right? The importance is that the cost of interventions is not that high in comparison to other interventions, and then the benefit will be substantial. Does that help a little bit, or did I
no. So the thing that I walk away with is that it's highly cost effective to prevent violence against children in schools, because it'll pay off multiple times in terms of what we invest in preventing violence against children. Yeah. And then whether it's 11 trillion or whether it's 10 trillion or whatever the number is, the key message is that the cost is really high around violence against children in terms of life. Thank you so much. So in this session, we've talked a little bit about why focus on schools. We've seen that the magnitude of the problem is huge and it's a complex problem. And then we've seen that it's cost effective to actually invest now rather than wait later on in the line. And so with that, now I will hand over to Chloe to help with a panel reflect on some of these issues. Over to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Deepak. So if you were not convinced, I think now you are, in terms of why we want to focus on preventing violence in and through schools. And it's in school, but also through schools, as Karen really pointed out, through the ripple effect, because many of the interventions that are effective to prevent violence against children actually happen in school, using school as a hub to work with families and caregivers and community members as well. So we're building on this first very, very compelling part on the magnitude of the scope of the issue, and as well the cost and the multi-pronged negative impact they have on children and their learning experience. And then the second part, we wanted to invite, very knowledgeable and very experienced speakers from different perspectives to really share with us what's next. What do we do with that? So we have set up the agenda, and the agenda is huge. As always, Karen, said at the beginning, we have 1 billion children suffering from violence every year, half of all children worldwide. Of course, not all of them experience violence in school, but many of them around school, on the way to school, or learning when they are at home or online. So everything is related. And so how do we build up tangible, concrete solution to actually accelerate progress? Because the problem is not new. We all know that. Now what's new is we actually have the cost to show it, we have the data to demonstrate the scope of it, and we have the evidence that point to certain types of intervention. So in this second session, we wanted to talk about how to build this momentum. And let me share my screen very quickly. Let me know if you see it. I think sorry for, do you see it? Yeah. So in this second session, basically, we wanted to capitalize on building this momentum. And the momentum is built through strengthening an ecosystem for change, which is also why, you know, the Coalition for Good School and the Safe to Learn Coalition came together to organize this event. Because everything, you know, when we say together we're stronger, it's not just a slogan, it's actually we mean it. And actually we need it. Because we have seen all over the past decades that one organization alone, even the most powerful one, actually cannot achieve tangible results at scale in terms of ensuring safe learning environments for children. So it really means that we need to build on the comparative advantage of different stakeholders to really complement each other and strengthen these ecosystem for change. And that is the mandate for Safe to Learn. So again, very quickly, Safe to Learn has 14 partners as of now, but in addition to the 14 partners that you can see on the screen, we have also sister organizations with whom we work very closely, like again, the Coalition for Good School that was just launched last month in September, very like-minded, and we go, you know, building on our own comparative advantage to advance toward the same vision. So in this second session, we have invited 3 key speakers and panelists to share with us their experience, their views from different perspectives. So they are all part of the Safe to Learn Coalition. We have UKED from UKFCDO from the donor community, the GP, the Global Partnership for Education, and the civil society organization coalition. So 3 fantastic speakers by themselves, not only because they belong to great organizations, but also because they have dedicated, you know, their life to the issue of violence prevention from different dimensions. So the first one is Emily Esplin, that you no need to present, no need to introduce. Emily has been a leader in the field and a champion. You know, she's heading the end violence team at UKFCDO, and she's really done a fantastic contribution through the What Works to End Violence program at UKFCDO. We'll talk more about that. Then we have Dr. Stuart Cameron from the GPE, who is leading on equity and inclusion within the GP and really pushing and working closely with us, with Deepak and myself, in terms of mainstreaming violence prevention within the GP. And finally, last but not least, Dr. John Kalaj, who is the Executive Director of Kali Elimu in Tanzania, a fantastic champion as well, you know, really showing that leading by doing, and really showing that preventing violence against children in and through school is actually possible, not only in Tanzania, but worldwide. He's also the co-founder of the Coalition for Good School. So welcome to the 3 of you. Oops, actually, I'll let this slide, actually, no, I'll just stop sharing so that we can see our panelists while we speak. So let me begin with Emily, if you will. So Emily, thank you for being with us. Again, you know, I mentioned the fantastic work that you've done through the What Works to Prevent Violence program, What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls program in particular. That was a fantastic contribution to the field. It took many, many years, but it was, you know, applauded by all the practitioners and all the people who are dedicated their lives to the issue. So big thank you for that. And you are aiding the End Violence program at UKFCDO. So within the What Works program, you highlighted some school-based violence prevention interventions that actually, you know, showed effectiveness to prevent violence in and through schools. And that was, you know, extremely important, as I said. But even though that was a huge contribution, you know, many, many things remain to be done. So now that you still sit within FCDO and as a leader in terms of donors, could you share with us, you know, some thoughts about where the donor community needs to go next in terms of really addressing the problem at the level that it deserves? Over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Chloe, and hello, colleagues. It's a real privilege to join this conversation today, particularly at such an important time, because it really feels like we're at a moment of opportunity right now, with, as you say, this expansion in the evidence base, with some pockets of investment. And I think more players mobilising around this issue of preventing violence in and through schools than we've seen before. So as we've heard, we do now have rigorous evidence, both on the scale and the cost of this problem, but also on what works to address it. We have studies that show that carefully designed, carefully implemented school-based interventions can reduce violence quite significantly within programme timeframes. We have the inspiring example, I think, from Uganda, from Raising Voices Good Schools Toolkit, which I know has been an inspiration to many of us. And as you say, Chloe, in the UK's What Works to Prevent Violence programme, we also saw that evidence-based interventions in schools were able to achieve significant reductions in violence of up to 50%. And also really encouragingly, both girls and boys also reported more gender equitable attitudes and improvements in their mental health. So I think these studies and others really point to the critical role of the education sector in addressing violence in and through schools, and also crucially their role, and Karen talked about this, in shaping children's understanding of gender norms and roles, and really supporting healthy non-violent relationships from a young age to actually stop violence before it starts. So I wanted to use my minutes today to reflect briefly on what we've learned in FCDO from our What Works programme and from other global studies that we've looked at, and then really where I think we as a community, including as a donor community, need to go forward from here. So firstly, we found that effective school-based interventions were those that had a strong focus on promoting children's critical thinking, so particularly around gender roles and the use of violence, in combination with building their skills. So for example, empathy, leadership, communication, conflict resolution. We found that light touch interventions tended not to be very effective, and also that well-trained teachers or facilitators were really important for success. And similarly, I think we see in the evidence that we do have, which is limited, on interventions to address teacher-perpetrated violence, we again do see the importance of both critical reflection on norms and beliefs, as well as providing alternative discipline strategies. So I think it's that combination that seems to be coming out as really important. We also found that this work takes time, and that brief interventions are unlikely to be effective, particularly when engaging with children and young adolescents. So I think a message really to my fellow donors is the importance of multi-year investments if we want to see sustainable reductions in violence. Particularly, I think, to do the really vital formative work around adapting curricula, training teachers, and so on, which we know is so important to success. We also saw that violence, or forms of violence, are very closely connected, and that what happens in the home impacts what happens at school and vice versa. And Quintin made this point. So, for example, in our What Works study in Pakistan, we found that 1 in 10 children had witnessed their mother being abused in the past month, and that these children were significantly more likely to have experienced or perpetrated peer violence in school. In another of our studies under What Works, we saw that boys who had witnessed their father fighting in the previous month were more than 8 times more likely to perpetrate peer violence at school than those that didn't. And we've also seen that experience of bullying in schools is closely related to dating violence. So I think we know that while the school system is critical, it can't solve the problem of violence alone, and we really do also need wider community and societal change that challenges that use of violence more widely and promotes gender equality. So we found that one of the critical factors behind the success of some of the What Works interventions was the combination of school-based activities alongside outreach to parents, families, communities, including local leaders. So that's some of what we've learned, but I think the most important question really that you put to me is, what do we do with this knowledge now to put this evidence base to work and really move into action? And I see 3 priorities. So I think firstly, clearly we need to leverage the evidence that we now have to really shore up political support, funding and momentum around ending violence in and through schools. And in FCDO, this evidence has been really powerful for us actually internally in making the case that prevention works and we can see impacts over programmatic timeframes. And this isn't just an insurmountable, intangible challenge. There's actually something that we can do about this. And I think this is where partnerships like Safe to Learn, the Coalition for Good Schools and End Violence are really playing such an important role in getting that evidence out there to multiple stakeholders, and using that really to mobilise action globally, but also to advocate with national governments for investments in evidence-based prevention to prevent violence in and through schools. And as a co-leader of the Generation Equality Action Coalition on GBV, in the UK, we also worked hard with our co-leads there to ensure that working with the education sector to prevent gender-based violence was identified as a priority for action. The second priority, I think, is that we need to now invest in carefully adapting the pilots that we have now seen can be effective, like the Good Schools Toolkit, like the What Works intervention in Pakistan by the organisation Right to Play, into scalable programmes that can be more widely implemented. And I think use the insights from the expanding evidence base to be adapting education programmes and systems. We know, as others have said, that school-based interventions naturally offer scope for scaling up as decisions about the curriculum, teacher training, referral systems are often made at the district or national level. So as others have said, schools really have reach as a platform to prevent violence. And I think if we can find ways to use this evidence to flex education programs and systems by applying a violence lens, this will be a really effective way to address violence at minimal additional cost. So I'm really excited that in FCDO, we've actually just started this month our successor programme to What Works, which is a new £67.5 million 7-year investment in testing the scale up of evidence-based violence prevention interventions, including, we hope, working in schools and in partnerships with ministries of education. We know that scaling up successful pilots and building this into education systems is really not going to be easy. That's why we want to do it and actually learn from that process. And it's really going to need the, I think, amazing expertise held in this community right here to do it well in a way that doesn't risk compromising the sort of quality and effectiveness and obviously crucially ethics, which I think is particularly important when working with children. So it feels like there's a real opportunity, but it's going to really need us to work together on this and draw on the expertise across, the education, health, child protection and violence against women fields. And I think Karen spoke to that problem of, really to work, we need all of these different sectors working together, and that's quite hard to do well. So lastly, I think while there has been an expansion in the evidence, I think it's really important that we avoid over-relying on the existing still quite limited evidence base and on only sort of replicating the most recent or really quite small handful of approaches that we have seen to be successful. And I think a lot more research and evidence is needed, in particular in relation to whole school approaches, which look so promising, but the evidence is quite limited still. I think in relation to the gendered aspects of violence in schools, and also around preventing teacher-perpetrated violence, especially sexual violence, which really feels like such a major gap still to me. And similarly, I think we know very little about the sustainability of our impacts over time. So that's another area that we'd really like to look into further. And I hope that the UK can continue to contribute to this through our What Works programme to really identify new solutions, but also I think to hone the solutions that we have now to keep moving the field forward. So thank you all of you, because I know you're doing amazing work on this issue, and I really look forward to continuing our partnership to progress what really does feel like a shared agenda, and actually to support the next generation of knowledge, but critically also to support its use to end violence in and through schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. These were brilliant remarks. And you mentioned many very important things, about the scaling up, the continuity, the prioritization of violence within the education, the need, to work multi-sectorally. I would just add the need also to work with many stakeholders within education, because there are many stakeholders within the education system per se, from the school level, at the school level, but also, throughout the level. And it's really what we're trying to do also to put everybody facilitating the collaboration within education. So I hope many peer donors will look forward to following the example of UKFCD of all what you've done. So thank you for that, and we look forward to keeping the work with you. Let me go to Stuart at the Global Partnership for Education. So we know that the GP went through a fantastic replenishment actually a couple of months ago during the summer of $4 billion to transform education and to respond to the learning crisis that was increased through the COVID pandemic, as everybody knows. So it's a fantastic achievement. And the GP was already a key player in terms of education and, as a fund and as a partnership. And also because, it's really work hand in hand with government and with countries in terms of supporting the processes of education sector plans and compact. So with this very country focus and all the knowledge and expertise that you have, Stuart, working with your colleagues and with your counterparts, could you share with us a little bit your experience and your insights on to what extent violence against children is actually picked up in education at the country level?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chloe, and everyone. I'm very happy to be here and to see the kind of increasing momentum this issue is getting, and hopefully to be part of that forward momentum through GPE. GPE, Global Partnership for Education, for those who might not be familiar, is GPE mobilizes partners and funds to support currently 76 lower income countries to transform their education systems. We've got a particular focus on trying to drive transformation at scale, especially through our recent strategy that we've recently refreshed, and to get the most vulnerable girls and boys in school. And we've got a particular approach that emphasizes convening partners behind country leadership. So acting on country priorities, but ensuring that the country has the support it needs to do evidence-based planning in the education sector, and working through local education groups in each country where the different development partners can raise issues and raise points of evidence to feed those into the planning process and the design of grants. Now in our work, we have definitely seen that policymakers and planners in partner countries, in GPE's partner countries, increasingly recognizing the importance of violence against children in and around schools as an issue that's like crucially important in itself, and also as a barrier to children being in school and learning in an inclusive and safe environment. Perhaps still patchy in terms of what they're actually doing, and still not commensurate with what we now know about the scale of the problem and the increasing evidence base, and not necessarily aware of and considering all the different forms of violence and giving equal importance to the forms of violence might take. So a couple of years ago, we reviewed the analyses of the education sector, the plans that different countries are coming up with, that our partner countries are coming up with, and the content of our own grants to look at a range of issues, including safety and violence. And only around 1 in 3 partner countries who were receiving GPE grants at that time actually discussed safety and violence in their education sector analyses. So, at that time, it was not necessarily a large part of the kind of standard template for how you analyze your education sector. But around half of them actually had planned activities relating to safety and violence. So the issue of safety and violence seems a bit unusual in that there's actually more sign of countries taking action on it, or at least planning to take action on it, than doing analysis, but still not as much as we would like to see of either. Several of GPE's partner countries are signatories to the Safe to Learn call to action. There are a number of examples of partner countries using GPE grants to protect children from violence, whether through promoting communication between schools and parents, pre-service and in-service teacher training, work on school-based management committees and local government in Nigeria, for example. So taking a number of different approaches, but perhaps still somewhat patchy and not necessarily at the large scale that we want to see. And recently, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, GP opened a big accelerated funding window for mitigation and recovery in the pandemic. And in this case, the proposals were actually required to address the needs of the most vulnerable, and including girls. And we did find that our partners, the country partners and the development partners working on these grants have recognized the need, recognized the danger of increased violence during the pandemic and in the return to school afterwards, and have come up with a range of ways of addressing it. So many countries are using the GP grants to run campaigns against gender-based violence during school closure, often planning to continue these campaigns after schools reopen. So some hopeful signs of a kind of building back better when it comes to making schools safer. So that there were, a range of different approaches there, and there is also a program of learning and evaluation of these programs, which we hope will be valuable beyond the pandemic and beyond the kind of immediate return to school, and understanding more about what works to protect children from violence in varied contexts, and begin to feed into that global evidence base that we're getting more strongly. On GP's side, we have this new strategic plan, a new operating model, which emphasizes an inclusive education and recognizes that an inclusive education system is one which supports all children to reach their full potential and ensures the well-being and safety of children. And we also have an even stronger and clearer set of expectations than we did before about education sector planning being gender responsive, making sure that countries consider gender in their planning, mainstream it across all of their activities. And the guidance that we have on this is quite explicit about addressing school-related gender-based violence in planning and activities that are funded. We have a girls' education accelerator, a new pot of money which can fund opportunities for girls, particularly in countries where girls' education has been a major challenge, and those countries which are identifying gender equality as a focus area. And that additional financing can be available for violence prevention, where this is a barrier to gender equality. So in our new operating model, we're aiming to support a stronger evidence basis for education planning, and helping countries to draw on a variety of different sources and stakeholders. And this means facilitating links with networks and initiatives like Safe to Learn, and making sure that the technical support is in place where countries need it and where countries do identify this as a priority, and combining that with the global advocacy that has to go on to kind of try and push the arguments for the full range of forms of violence being addressed in a sustainable and scalable way across different countries, and producing evidence on violence and safety, but also building in immediate activities, a bit like the range of next steps, which Emily concluded with. Going ahead and planning activities with the evidence basis we already have, while continuing to gather more evidence, especially in countries which have a very limited context-specific evidence basis to date. And yeah, so I mean, a lot of GPs partner countries are showing through their planning or through the priorities identified in COVID grants that they recognize in broad terms the need for action in this area, and they are prioritizing it to some extent in their planning and in the things that they are asking for money for from funding sources like GPE. But it's really essential at this stage for development partners to be there in each country, to support this, make sure it's contextually appropriate and evidence-based interventions or design in each country, and turn it into meaningful action at a large enough scale within each of those countries.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Stuart. I don't mean to interrupt you, but time is flying, unfortunately. And I think, you gave us already a fantastic overview of what, the GP is doing to support the agenda, in particular through the accelerator, but also, making sure that school-related GBV is taken into account. And through the partnership that we're building together to really push forward the agenda within, all the GP grants moving forward to have a violence prevention lens into them. And because it's exactly what you said, and actually that's a nice transition to our to Dr. John, our last speaker. It's not about just doing it, but it's doing it well. And he's doing it well with very high ethical standards to make sure that we do no harm first and foremost. And so it's important that we build up on the, the respective skills that, all of us can bring to the table. So a big thank you to you, Stuart. That leads me about, doing it well and, building on the respective skills and skill set of different stakeholders. To Dr. John, thank you very much for being with us today. So you're the co-founder, one of the co-founders of the Coalition for Good School, and the CEO for Eli. I'm sorry, the name, but anyway, and we wanted to actually follow up on the question that was quite recurrent during our conversation about the whole school approach and about what is needed to actually making it right, making it well. Because we know that one thing is to say, well, we have the Good School Toolkit, we have the whole school approach, everybody agrees that's the way to go. Another way is to do it in a way that is context-based, that is accepted, that is building on the dynamics, the challenges that are in the local sector, and in a way that is effective and sustainable. So could you share with us a little bit your thinking, your insights about this issue on how to do it well, in particular from building on the expertise from practitioners and experts from the Global South? Over to you. You're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Many thanks, Claude, for welcoming me, and I feel so honored to be one of the speakers in this very important event that is co-hosted by Coalition for Good School and the Safe to Learn initiative. I just want to start by picking from the previous speakers by emphasizing that education is the right of every child, and has all of us have an obligation to make sure that the schools must be a safe place for every child to be in order to access their constitutional rights, build a friendship, critical skills, and navigate social situations, including preparation to become productive citizens in future. However, several studies across the globe show that schools are not very safe place for children to be, as many girls and boys do experience violence in forms of bullying, harassment, verbal abuse, sexual harassment and exploitation, corporal punishment, and other forms of humiliation. And a large number of these children are from Global South, and they are prevented from fully engaging in their educational opportunities due to fear of violence and harm that is perpetrated in learning environment, be it at school or on the way to school, at home, or online. And especially nowadays, cyberbullying is quite common. When children and the adolescents experience violence in schools and other education in schools and in other education settings, it can cause a serious harm that can last into adulthood. And this is confirmed by UNESCO study of 2017. Globally, there are around about 720 million school-age children who live in countries where they are not fully protected by laws from corporal punishment. And this is confirmed by recent UNICEF studies. Many countries in the Global South, including Tanzania, are pioneering policies, legislative strategies, strategic efforts to ensure universal child protection. However, despite of these efforts, violence against children in school is very high. My organization, Hakelim, has conducted a study that we launched the report in March, which has found that 87.9% of the interviewed school children have experienced the physical violence, with the caning being mentioned as the most common type. This is just an example, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that there are many, the situation is similar in many countries, and there's a lot of studies which confirm this. The Global South practitioners like myself are very much aware of many factors, including policies, including cultural practices, including religious belief that perpetuate violence against children. Again, there is also inadequacy of legal framework, like in the Western countries or in the Northern countries, the policies and the strategies and intervention that could contribute towards a reduction of violence against children in school. Now, in order to address these challenges, it is therefore important, from my perspective, that a significant and proportional policy ideas and the practical intervention to be informed by those who are on the ground, who are on the ground and who have on the ground experience. This does not mean that we do not appreciate the contribution of our brothers and sisters in the global north in tackling the problem. But I, for one, and also I believe even the members of the Coalition for Good School, strongly believe that when we elevate and amplify voices of practitioners in the global south, we are more likely to arrive at solutions that are sustainable and which could work better for all. I'm also aware that there are many efforts to prevent violence against children, as we have heard. But as the previous speakers, including Deepak, have just alluded to, and this is what most of the members of Coalition for Good School believe, that prevention of violence against children in school is a unique and a particular opportunity, as the schools are governed by policies and can be monitored in a way that homes can't be. You will also agree with me that schools in the global south are significantly different to schools in the global north. Many of our schools are overcrowded, underfunded, and we have demotivated teachers and poor oversight. That's why it is important that we have voices of practitioners from global south who are designing interventions, who are experimenting different ideas, and have developed instincts about what is likely to work in such spaces.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm sorry, Dr. John. I have to have the hard job to interrupt you, unfortunately, because time flies and we're at the near end of our event, and we were enjoying very much your beautiful comments. But
I just want to finish by saying that since most of children do live and go to school in the global south, I believe that the voices, I believe that the experience, I believe that the knowledge from the global south is crucial in order to ensure that the schools are a safe place for children to be in order to enjoy their constitutional right to education. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we absolutely fully agree with you. And it was very well said. Many of the children actually live in the global south. And so it makes no sense not to include the fantastic practitioners and experts from the global south to find the solutions that are adequate to their context. So thank you so much for your remarks. I will hand over to Deepak for the conclusion, because unfortunately, again, we are near the end of the event. If some of you in the audience want to stay a few minutes longer, we will be able to take one questions from the audience. But let me give the floor to Deepak.
Thank you, Chloe. And we really, we're short of time. So let me just take 2 minutes to kind of bring it together a little bit. That we started off with really opening remarks from Howard, emphasizing that at a global level, we're recognizing that this is a problem. We talked about why school is a particular opportunity in terms of strategic interventions that we could make. We heard from Karen that the magnitude of the problem is huge. We heard from Quentin that in some ways it's really cost effective to make investments now because the long-term lifetime costs are really high for the entire global community. We heard from Emily that we need we now have evidence and we have experience so that we need to start investing in longer term programs. We need to address the entire ecosystem that is surrounding the education sector, and that we do need to expand our repertoire of interventions that we're developing. And then we also heard from John and Stuart about the importance of education sector getting involved, and John talking about practitioners on the front line having a significant voice in determining where we go from here. Yeah. Collectively, we hope that this presents to you a fertile case about why, as a global community, we should be investing in the issue of violence against children in school, and that there's a compelling case here that we should prioritize the issue of violence against children in and through schools. Okay? With that, we know that many colleagues will have to leave at this moment because we've reached the end of our time. If the panelists are willing to stay a little bit longer, there are some questions that are addressed to the panelists. So we will continue, but we will also understand if people need to drop off. Yeah. So, Chloe, are there any questions, or do you want to make any concluding statement before we go to some of the questions?
No, thank you, Deepak. You did it perfectly. Just to mention that if some of the participants in the audience need to leave but want to send us questions, they can do so at the Safe to Learn email. You will find it in the chat box, and we will make sure that many, will get responses from the panelists today. So that's another option. But if we have time just for one question before we leave, and again, thank you to all for the fantastic, insights and remarks today. We have one in terms of that speaks to many of the interventions actually, and that is from our colleague Sarah Morgan, that said that donors continue to cite the lack of evidence as a reason not to invest long term. What advice would panelists give on convincing donors to invest in longer term investment when ending violence against children is a no-brainer and we have a growing body of evidence? What is the way forward? So if anyone wants to share their thought about the way to convince so that the sector is actually funded enough so that we can keep working together to change the life of children in and through schools. Any volunteers?
Yes, one thing on my side. I mean,
Quentin.
I mean, I know that we have gone to that question of is there enough evidence or not for a while, right? And I mean, we have to recognize that most of the evidence is from high-income countries, right? And then when people say that there is not enough evidence, I think they think about low or middle-income countries. So I think there are two responses. One is that we need more evidence still, even though we may be convinced and there's a lot of evidence in high-income countries, we need more for the global south. That's one. But two, we need to get a much clearer handle on what are the costs of the interventions, right? If you're talking about high-cost interventions, then I understand why there is hesitancy, because there are many, many different priorities, and it's difficult to choose. If we can do a better job at documenting carefully and providing tools to people to simulate what might be the cost and then what might be a reasonable return or impact and things like that, then this will be taken up much more, right? And I mean, several people have said, well, we need to do that seriously. Well, it takes several years, and of course, right? But my impression is that it's not necessarily very costly in comparison to some other types of interventions, and I think we need to devote much more work to that.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you. Karen, the last word, and then we'll have to conclude. Thank you.
Just wanted to briefly highlight perhaps the difference between lack of evidence and lack of programming, because I think what the work of the coalition has shown already is that actually there's a lot going on in the Global South in terms of programming. But from a research standpoint, perhaps that hasn't necessarily been evaluated in such a way that it is sort of existing within the global academic literature, which is very much from the global north. So I think, to me as a researcher, I see a research agenda there, although I probably see them everywhere. I think it's an obvious place for future work.
Absolutely, and how to focus on the core elements for adaptation and scaling up, as also Emily said before. Absolutely. Well, from my side and from the Safe to Learn Coalition, a huge thank you to all the panelists and all the participants. And Deepak, over to you for the last word before we.
No, I just also wanted to amplify Emily's other point, which is that we really need to increase our repertoire of directions through which interventions can come. So whole school approach is one, but there are other places as well where we could learn a little bit more about and get granular in terms of how to create intervention. Having said that, I think that I want to echo John's point that we really need diverse set of voices and that we need platforms like Global Partnership on Education to bring the issue of violence against children in school as a centerpiece rather than just an adjunct to how we address education system. And we do need investors and donors who are thinking a little bit longer term in terms of what outcomes we need to bring. Yeah, but there is collectively, I think there was a strong case today that we know how to move forward a little bit. Now is to generate will and momentum and keep building on that momentum. With that, I want to thank all the participants and the panelists, also on behalf of Coalition for Good Schools, and we hope to work with you in terms of generating that momentum. Thank you, and thank you for participating today.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.